thank you very much. Let's talk about the major challenges to everything that I just said, right? So biblical archaeology is a discipline that is full of controversy, right? Initially, when I was just trying to figure out what I want to do with my life, I'm like, I want to do something that's not particularly controversial. I just kind of want to do my thing. I'm like, right? Other plans if I'm studying the archaeology of Israel, you're always treading lightly because you're gonna offend someone no matter what you publish. So my personal favorite example is for our dig site. We found some stuff and we've been criticized by individuals saying that we are biblical fundamentalists attempting to just prove the Bible, but the same article had comments saying, you guys are biblical minimalists, you're not going far enough. So I guess we're both, or we're right where we're supposed to be. So this final lecture portion is going to introduce the great challenge that has been raised in the 1990s and early 2000s to the predominant traditional paradigm of the hegemony of David and Solomon, and look at some of the insights that have possibly come into this from our particular region of focus, that is Tel Hesi, and the excavations that are ongoing, both at Tel Hesi, though from an earlier period, and from Khirbet Summeily, which is our active site. So here's Tel Megiddo. Right, I've mentioned this before. It's a major Canaanite site. It is a classic example of a tell, right? So you have all these different layers of history, right? And true to the paradigm of biblical archaeology, the different layers that you peel down, the deeper you dig, the older the stuff gets. Well, dating just how old those layers are is a matter of controversy. How do you tell precisely, other than like this thing is deeper than this thing, that means this thing's older? You don't just want relative dates. You want to have something firmer. So prior to the 1950s, the best way to do this was to typologically sort and seriate pottery. William Matthew Flinders Petrie was a mathematical genius in doing so. He was able to type pottery and show these different overlapping sequences that allow you to say the age of a site, at least relatively speaking. Starting in the 1950s, however, great developments in the sciences, the hard sciences, brought about the invention of radiocarbon dating. You've probably heard of this at least a little bit. It is a method of radiometric dating that relies on the decay of elements. So radiocarbon dating, it dates the percentage of carbon-14 as it undergoes decay. So students in the audience pay attention, right? In math class, they talk about like, how do you calculate the rate of decay? It actually matters. This is the one sort of practical example I have of where that math lesson comes into play. And I always remember wishing I'd paid more attention in high school math when they went through, this is why you need to know this. But radiocarbon dating uses that particular formulation of how much carbon has been converted, how this decay has taken place, by using the half-life of carbon, right? So there you get into really the weeds with this. Suffice to say, I'm not going to go through all the mathematics of it. By calculating the amount of carbon left in a sample, you can get a range of dates. This is typically called something like absolute dating. I think that might give it a little bit too much, right? Like, oh, we know exactly when. It gives you a time range, right? And you still need to interpret the data a little bit. You need to clean it up a little bit. But generally speaking, it gives you a much more precise time range for dating archaeological layers. So the site of Tel Megiddo was excavated right early on by American excavations out of the University of Chicago, establishes this traditional chronology. Further insights continue to build on this. Then starting in 1995, continuing in 1996, 2001, so on, a scholar out of Tel Aviv University named Israel Finkelstein published his insights from the excavations of Megiddo. Finkelstein is the excavator of the site of Megiddo, and his radiocarbon dating, his interpretations of this, led him to reject the traditional formulation of chronology for the Holy Land. Initially, this is 1995 is a while back, but really from the early 2000s, what you get is something like this, right? You have the traditional chronology, right, and you have Finkelstein's revisions to this, based solely on considerations from the dating of Tel Megiddo. So looking at the site of Megiddo, Finkelstein considers the site a type site for the history of the Levant. Like a miniature of the history of the entire region can be found in the levels of this particular site. In doing so, and looking at this, what he has done, it really does pull into question everything we just talked about the unified reign of David and Solomon. How so? According to Finkelstein's initial formulation of this theory, the Solomonic gates, those 6-chambered chariot parking stalls, were not destroyed by Pharaoh Shishak. If you're a Raiders of the Lost Ark fan, that's the guy that supposedly takes the Ark and brings it back to Tanis and that, right? He's a real pharaoh, right? Shishak or Shoshank is, in the traditional chronology, he destroys a number of sites in Palestine around 925. According to Finkelstein, those destruction levels need to be redated to about 840. That's a big difference, right? Absolutely. If you talk to some of my colleagues in, say, paleoanthropology, right? You're like, oh yes, this fossil organism lived 1.5 to 1.2 million years ago. And they're like, great, that's phenomenal. 1.5 to 1.2 million years is an acceptable time difference. Well, this matters a great deal. I mean, a lot of times like, oh, what's 100 years? Well, for the biblical narrative, 100 years is actually a really big deal. Either these architectural features were built by Solomon and David, as the biblical account implies, or they were built by somebody else, and the Bible falsely attributed them to David and Solomon. Right, so that's a great deal at stake, right? Did the Bible lie about how complicated David and Solomon's kingdom was? Did the Bible even make up these characters to begin with to justify the dominance of the southern tribe of Judah? Right, these are questions that scholars have really sort of taken and run with following the more sensational publications of the low chronology in the early 2000s. Since this time, there has been a massive program of archaeological research trying to figure out what's going on. One of the great issues with radiocarbon dating is that in our region, you end up with a serious problem because radiocarbon dates don't tell you everything straight out of the machine. They need to be calibrated based on atmospheric fluctuations in carbon. Well, if you look at a radiocarbon curve, right, a calibration curve, for this period of history in Israel, this curve actually doubles back on itself. So anytime you calibrate a date, there are two possibilities, one early date or one late date. The early date, generally speaking, tends to line up more closely with the biblical account, the high chronology. The later date is what has been selected to form the low chronology. Then there's like the middle chronology people that say, just divide them in half. And you're like, what? Okay. Generally, this was the view, but more evidence has come to light. There's been more radiocarbon studies. We've tried to get better access to calibration, but moreover, there have been studies using other types of dating material. You don't just need to use carbon. So, for example, there are methods that can date objects based on fluctuations in Earth's magnetic field. This is called paleomagnetism. So there's a lot of science behind it. I'm not a hard scientist, but in terms of how it works, when objects are heated, let's say pottery is heated in a destruction, right? It's burned really, really hot. There are iron particles in it, which will actually freeze the direction of magnetic north. Well, magnetic north has hopped around a little bit. Right, if you look at the fluctuations of the magnetism of the Earth, and handing these objects over to paleomagnetic geologists, they are actually able to date, right, when Earth's magnetic north was at particular positions, right? And so that's another method you can use to double-check some of these dates, right? And over the course of the past decade and a half, Finkelstein has needed to update his initial program, right? This is more or less what we are left with, right? You'd notice a lot of that is gone. A lot of the previous dates, he's saying, oh, this thing wasn't destroyed, this thing wasn't destroyed. Notable things you have here, right? He dates the destruction of Gezer and Megiddo, right? He sees that as Shishak. He sees that Pharaoh preceding the Solomonic cities, right? So like that's basically the only thing that he's still got He says that the Philistines start after 1130 because that's when you see their pottery. Right? He seems to make the assumption that the pottery of the Philistines equals the Philistines, right? And so he dates that arrival a little bit later rather than the around 1150 date, which was postulated by Albright and others from the previous period. So even with all of those sort of changes, it's still a big deal, right? Even this is still a reasonably big deal for Finkelstein. Why? Because according to him, the Solomonic gates, the cities, those are constructed by the divided monarchy. So quick crash course in the history of Israel. According to the biblical text, David and Solomon have a united kingdom. Yay. Solomon's son Rehoboam messes everything up. He's not a particularly good ruler, and especially in tribal polities where you need to try to keep not just your family, your own tribe happy, but 11 others. He's not very good at diplomacy. Right? If you know the biblical text, he tells people, I'm going to make whips out of scorpions, and I'm going to drive you guys even harder than my dad. Not what the people needed to hear. The 10 northern tribes rebel against Rehoboam and found their own kingdom, right? The kingdom of the northern kingdom of Israel. According to Finkelstein, it is the northern kingdom that is responsible for the construction of these architectural features previously associated with the kingdom of David and Solomon. What that still does is mean that the biblical editors have transferred the glorious achievements of the northern kingdom of Israel to the founding heroes of their own mythology. Right? Finkelstein doesn't say David and Solomon were complete mythical figures, but he does say that they ruled a cow town. Right? Jerusalem was nothing more than just this tiny little hole-in-the-wall nothing. Right? It wasn't even a real city. Right, until later on, until after this supposed divided monarchy period. If that's true, you have to basically rewrite the entire biblical historical account, right? If David and Solomon's kingdom is nothing more than just this really tiny, non-important entity, they've invented quite a bit of history in terms of what we're dealing with. So it does still matter, right? What I want to turn to now in the last roughly 20 minutes is considerations from the excavations that we have performed in the region of Tel Hesi, that may shed some light on the question of just how in control an entity in the hill country was during the 10th century BC. Right? Let's, for the sake of argument, call that entity the United Kingdom of David and Solomon. If it existed, what sort of evidence might one find from excavations in the south? Note, Finkelstein's chronology is based on the site of Megiddo way up north, not really taking into account evidence that's being found in the south. Right, the region of Tel Hesi. Where is our particular dig site? There's a beautiful view of it. Right, it's right next to a flowing wadi, the Nahal Shikma. Right, here's a map locating where our dig site is. So Tel Hesi has a very celebrated excavation career going back to Flinders Petrie, Frederick Jones Bliss, and then in the 1970s and 80s, a renewed excavation was begun by the Joint Archaeological Research team sent to Tel Hesi to basically chart the developments in biblical archaeology from Petrie to sort of the 1960s, 1970s to sort of show how far the discipline had come. That's what we have for our location. One of the things to note about our region, right, as we're looking at this in terms of the history of occupation, is what are people doing in this part of Judah? If you look at historical texts, there's a lot of assumptions that because we are by the Nahal Shikma, and because you're dealing with an agricultural population in later areas, later periods in different areas, you're dealing with a sedentary agricultural population. That seems to have been an assumption that people made back to historical geographers moving through the region saying, like, man, someone's not doing a very good job taking care of this land. This should all be full of wheat fields. Instead, it's surrounded by desert. All right, what do I mean? During the Iron Age period, we really don't have a lot of sites in our particular region. Right, so I've circled Tel Hesi, I've circled Khirbet Summeily, right? These are based on results of a archaeological survey conducted by my predecessors in the study of the Hesi region, right, that have uncovered really not all that many sites, right? The hope was, okay, let's try to find a sedentary agricultural site. Well, Tel Hesi was not a sedentary agricultural village, right? We'll talk about what we think was going on at the site, but it wasn't that. So Khirbet Summeily is selected as a potential other example of a sedentary agricultural site using this region for the growing of crops, right? Here is a wonderful map showing you rainfall patterns in Israel, right? The thing to note, our dig site is in a very marginal zone for rainfall, right? So you can grow crops using rain-fed agriculture if it's a good year, at least in theory, right? But as we looked at the archaeological record of different periods in our site, there really isn't a lot of evidence of agriculture. And so this led to a paradigm shift in our project's thinking. What if, instead of dealing with an agricultural hinterland between biblical Israel and Philistia, what if we're dealing with something altogether different? What if we're dealing with an open field? All people in the biblical world were not farmers, right? A major source of economic welfare, as well as secondary agricultural products, was the maintenance of sheep and goats, right? These sorts of flocks need grazing land. Grazing land was so important in the ancient world. You have whole positions in the Assyrian Empire, shout out to the Thai, where there's actually a shepherd. Like the king actually appoints a shepherd to report to him to make sure that people aren't overgrazing. So maybe we start thinking, we're thinking about our region wrong. We're looking for an agricultural hinterland to Judah that's supplying the kings of Jerusalem maybe with sources. What if we're dealing with something else? In terms of what else might be happening in the region, right? There are some insights from very early in Tel Hesi's history that indicate what sort of wealth this area would provide or could provide to political entities interested in it, right? Even if they're not building large agricultural villas. What I've located here is the workshop area of the early Bronze Age Canaanite city of Tel Hesi. So we're talking about 2800 BC, so very, very early in the settlement history of Tel Hesi. We have what appears to be a workshop. Right. Recently, my colleagues and I have studied these artifacts. They're also creatively called incised bone tubes. Right. They are long bones of cattle that have been incised in geometric patterns. These are indicative of an artistic tradition that appears to have been produced locally at this particular site. But it made us think. We have in this area a lot of heating features. There are ovens. There's even within the city wall a corridor that could be considered some sort of kiln. They're burning something, a lot of it, right? They're probably not doing all of this just to produce a couple incised pretty bone objects. So the question became, what are they doing at this site? And our current hypothesis is that they are making use of local plant life. Right? That is, they're collecting something called Salsola kali, which is a strong alkali source. We hypothesize that they are burning these plants to produce potash. Potash is the key ingredient in lye. Right? So we hypothesize that a local plant was something of great economic importance to the early Bronze Age inhabitants of this site. Right? And one of the things you can look at, right? So props to my advisor and I, we've been working on this for a while. There appears to be a relationship between the type of soil indicative of our region and the distribution of this particular type of plant. Why do we care so much about this plant, the use of lye? Well, one, if we can demonstrate this, we're still working on the fine details of it through various scientific analyses here at UW, but if it is demonstrated, this would be the earliest example of lye manufacture in the Holy Land. All right, so that's significant because we can see within the biblical account what's the importance of lye. It's used to clean things. Why do we care about cleaning things? Lye is used to purify wool, which is the main component of clothing. So is it possible that in later periods, as well as in these earlier periods, there are non-agricultural products, plants, that were useful to people in this region? It's a possibility. What's more important, however, in terms of our thinking for the question of David and Solomon's kingdom, is evidence from the top of Tel Hesi itself. So Frederick Joan Bliss's excavations revealed 3 tripartite pillared buildings atop Tel Hesi in Bliss's City 5. So this would be putatively the Iron 2A in his chronological sequence in our modern sense. Here's a sort of cleaned up image of what we're dealing with on top of the mount. So there's something in this area worth something. Is it lie? Is it simply grazing ground for sheep and goats? Well, what's happening at Tel Hesi tells us it's probably something worth defending. If these sites, right, remember here's Hatzor, if these are actually related to chariot stables, that would be the presence of a really important military entity at Tel Hesi. There's no farmland really around, so are you stationing soldiers specifically to protect pasturage? Are you stationing them to protect some other product that is not just wheat? We don't quite know, but the fact of these buildings being present is something, right? I think this map is absolutely key to responding to the questions of the low chronology. This is a distribution created by my advisor, Jeff Blakely, simply correlating the 10th century tripartite pillared buildings locations, those are the squares, with the account of 1 Kings chapter 4, verses 7 to 19. If you look at the two maps, the locations of tripartite pillared buildings from Tel Hesi, right, all over, they appear like you can draw a circle around them, right? That circle seems to correlate with the borders of the kingdom of Solomon as described in the first book of Kings, right? That, I think, is very, very intriguing evidence about the utility of these structures and the importance of the control of trade. Why the control of trade? If you look at where these tripartite pillared buildings are, regardless of whether they're stables or bazaars, they're located at the edge of a political entity. That is our hypothesis looking at the distribution pattern of these structures. They're also located at known major roads, where these roads move into the particular polity that it seems to trace, right? I think that is pretty key evidence for the use of these structures. Repeated that. Awesome. So controlling this area is something that someone is very interested in doing, right? If it is controllable by the state, they could feed countless sheep and goats, they could harvest other types of plants, and they could control trade entering and exiting the political entity we're dealing with. So the follow-up site, if that's going on at Tel Hesi, the question was, what else is happening in the region? So you have these potential chariot stables that seem to be part of a defensive system for something that spans both the north and the south. Note there weren't tripartite pillared buildings, at least yet found, that separate clearly between the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah. It seems to trace, at least at this period, a circle that encompasses both. Well, maybe insights from the site of Khirbet Summeily, which is close by Tel Hesi, could give us some information. We went looking, right, the generation of scholars before me went looking for a farmstead. What we ended up finding was a single building that appears to be administrative and cultic in function. Right? They dug a hole and they found a cult room, like a small mini temple. Right? Not what you would expect of a farmstead. We have a couple different phases of archaeological excavation at the site. The two main that we consider is phase 5, our earlier phase, right, of one large structure. It's not a farmstead. It's not a house, right? Phase 3 is a rebuild of the same thing. It appears that this is one large building, right? And what's this building doing here? We argue it is an administrative outpost, right? What are we finding here? Why we're saying this is not just any old farmstead? We're finding amazing things that you wouldn't expect a farmer to have in their back room. For example, a lion-headed installation for that cultic chamber, right? There's debate whether it was a sheep. Lion, we'll go with lion, right? So this was probably affixed to the plaster wall. In that same room, you have this gorgeous, gorgeous cultic vessel, right? Additionally, you have evidence of long-distance trade with Egypt. So particularly, you have evidence of Nile perch, right? So a distinctive species from the Nile River actually must have been dried, and someone brought it to this particular site, Khirbet Summeily, pretty far from Egypt, right? They were eating their dried fish. I promised beads would make another appearance, right? The beads found at Khirbet Summeily so far are classically Egyptian, right? Most of them in form. Particularly, you see this little pendant. It's missing the top. This is an absolutely classic Egyptian-style artifact. An alabaster bead, also distinctively Egyptian, a scarab, right, made out of faience, a classically Egyptian type of material culture. Additionally, we have small amulet figurines. This was one that I had spent a good deal of time studying, and make the argument that this is the Egyptian god Ta-Sokar, right, which was a deity also venerated in the Canaanite pantheon. So you have this small little figurine. It has exceptional parallels to Ta-Sokar figurines at other sites in Israel, but particularly also in Egypt. So there does seem to be a good deal of interregional interaction even at this small site. The most important thing that has been discovered so far, however, are a number of bulla. So I've marked a couple of the locations of these, right? What is a bulla? Right? Well, a bulla is an impressed piece of clay indicative of administrative functions. So here's an example of one of the bullae from our dig site. Let's say you want to send a package to someone, right? Like a Christmas gift. You've wrapped it up, you got the bow. Well, how do you tell that no one's tampered with the bow, no one's gotten into the package? Well, if you think of like medieval kings, if they seal an envelope, what do? You grab your signet ring, you stamp some wax, and now you know that the royal page didn't tamper with what's inside. Similar process took place in the ancient Middle East with clay. So you would put clay on a document or on a package, you would stamp it, and that is evidence of administrative practice, right? It's like the DMV, right? Someone is trying to keep track of this. It's like tax accountants. Someone is saying, I checked this package. Our dig site, as of 2023, we have more than 20 of these objects confirmed as administrative bullae. Why do we care about that? Some of them have papyrus reed impressions on them. Others of them appear to have string holes in them. These are used to seal and stamp the movement of packages, the movement of letters. So our small outpost seems to have been tied into some major trade networks. Problem for the poor folks out at our site. We haven't found major city walls yet. Hopefully we will find them. We think we may have found something, but our site doesn't have a very impressive defensive system, right? But they're doing administrative functions that would necessitate tax accountants being on site. They have a small cult shrine, which would probably necessitate religious personnel. Unless these guys are working double shifts as soldiers as well as priests and tax accountants, you probably need someone to protect you. It is likely, we would argue, that our site's proximity to Tel Hesi serves a dual function. One, Hesi is protecting the region for sheep and goats, and two, Hesi, with the presence of these chariot stables, is able to send a rapid response to help the poor tax accountants stuck at Khirbet Summeily if those Philistines decide to come and attack. It's significant that we argue the site is most probably to be affiliated with the Judahites, that is the southern kingdom of Israel, based on the overwhelming number of pottery vessels that correlate with the hill country, that is that Iron 2A, red slipped, and burnished. What do we make of this? Well, we think our site is located on a major road. In fact, we know it was located on a major road in later periods. A Roman road passed right by the general vicinity of Khirbet Summeily. An Islamic period road also passed through the area at Lachish, which is right across the field from our dig site. Lachish was the site of an Islamic postal station, right? So we raise the possibility that this dig site, Khirbet Summeily, is something akin to the Pony Express, right? That you're dealing with an outpost on the very edge of a state-level entity, some governmental power that has tax accountants and charioteers on their payroll, and has a vested interest in examining and taxing goods, right? The idea being you move from one station to the next. Our site is located approximately a day's ride from Gaza. Right, so if Gaza is a major port in the Mediterranean and a Philistine site, we're right on the border. We're right there. Is it possible that's what we're dealing with? Right? I think it is a reasonable conclusion. All right, so what does all of this mean for the kingdom of David and Solomon? I think we've shown, at least at our dig site, that there is some complex political government operating in the south of Israel, right, that actually ties into material culture and dig sites that encompass both the south and the north. Have we proven that David and Solomon's kingdom existed because we found administrative bulla? No. But have we shown that there is evidence for a complex bureaucracy, right, in this particular part of the world that is not accounted for in the low chronology? I believe we can say we absolutely did that. So, in conclusion to the entire sort of adventure we've had today, hopefully I've been able to demonstrate what I set out to do, which is that biblical archaeology can vividly illuminate the narratives of Scripture, right? Rather than simply a war of proof and disproof, what archaeologists can provide is a rational demonstration of historical plausibility, right? And in that account, I have not encountered archaeological evidence in anything that I have studied up to this point that has caused me to shake or abandon my faith in the veracity of the scriptural accounts. Right? I remain a Christian and a biblical archaeologist. I think the two are perfectly compatible, and I think it actually has greatly enriched my own faith to get in touch with the tangible, the material, the physical remains from the time periods described in the biblical narratives. Well, the study of these artifacts, the study of the data, requires interpretation. Those interpretations themselves require separate hermeneutics. You need some other worldview to interpret the evidence of archaeology. And that is the role of theology, that is the role of philosophy. The role of archaeology is to continue to make fascinating discoveries like this, and I leave you with one of my favorites, everyone always asks. That is a thumbprint from about 1000 BC. Right? That is a thumbprint impressed in a small piece of clay that we excavated from our site. That's why I'm an archaeologist. I'm not here trying to disprove the Bible, get anyone's faith wrecked. I'm not here to do that, right? I'm here to establish for believers and non-believers alike a physical, tangible connection to the past in this vital part of the world. Thank you very much.